My guest is none other than E. Michael Jones, who is a scholar. He's an author of many excellent books that I've read over the years. Culture Wars magazine, available online. He's got a new book coming up, Logos Rising. Michael, thanks for joining me today. Yep. This whole situation right now with the coronavirus actually reminds me of a book you wrote years ago called Monsters from the Ide, The Rise of Horror in Fiction.
Yes. I think there are similarities. Yes. As a matter of fact, I talked about them in the article. But go ahead. You tell me. You do the talking now.
Well, it's sort of like this invisible secret enemy that is permeating the world. It's like from outer space or something, some alien, and that it's lurking outside our door, and that we're all here shuddering in fear. And I have a wife who is running around with a wiping everything and spraying everything, and just in a real state of fear. And I'm not suggesting here that this isn't a big problem. I mean, there is a reality, which is that we are dealing with a virus. I can speak to this. My daughter has it. She's fine, thank God. She's better. She's going to be free of it in a matter of days, and then she'll be joining us again. But so I don't in any way question the reality here, and I tell people to be careful. However, you talk about in your essay a very interesting dichotomy between what you refer to as reality and then things of the mind. And the reality is the virus. The things of the mind gets into, first of all, the origins of the virus, whether or not this is some kind of a natural phenomena, or whether we should look to growing evidence that this might be a biological weapon that came out of China, and also the politics of this. It is a little too convenient how this has resulted in what can only be described as a virtual medical martial law. Right. We're all stuck in our homes now. Right. We have lost our liberty in the real sense.
Right. You're right. Yeah, categories of the mind and categories of reality. And I tried to point out that for centuries now, the English ideology is to basically base their political system or some category of the mind on an indisputable category of reality, as if to say their policies are as indisputable as the reality that they are talking about. Well, that's not the case. They're two separate things. And the best example I can give would be feminism. Okay? Woman, obviously, the world is divided up between men and women. You can't deny that there are women out there. It's indisputable. And then the next step is, well, if you accept that, then you have to accept women's rights, right? Well, women deserve rights, don't they? That's indisputable, right? And so the next step is, well, you have to accept abortion. Well, wait a minute. How did I get from A to B here? Something happened. Someone just pulled a fast one. And the fast one that they pulled is substituting a quick switch between a category of the mind, a category of reality, to suddenly a category of the mind. And I think we're seeing that happening before our eyes. Now, I have lots of correspondence all over the world, and I just got a call yesterday from a friend in Delhi, India. And India is under lockdown. This is the entire subcontinent of India.
Incredible.
That's 1.2 billion people. And how many cases of how many deaths of coronavirus do they have in India? Do you know?
Maybe a handful.
They have 27 deaths.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I can't, math was never my strong suit, but I can't even calculate what percentage that is of 1.2 billion. So you basically lock down the entire country because of 27 deaths. I mean, I was in Calcutta. They pick up that many bodies every morning of people who just drop dead on the streets of Calcutta. And in doing this, they have created enormous economic dislocation. primarily because there is a class of people in India, they're known as the untouchables or the Dalits. And these people live from hand to mouth. And they are basically day laborers. They get hired a day at a time. And at the end of the day, they get their salary, and then they go home and they buy food, and that's how they survive. Well, they're all out of work. They are all completely out. Now, this is millions of people who are now heading back to their traditional home in India. So these are people. Now, if you're interested in containing the spread of a disease, you've got a population here that doesn't have access to normal Western hygiene, who are now marching through the country and potentially spreading the very disease that they are claiming that they want to contain. So there is an element of irrationality that's starting to emerge. And in this irrationality, I think we start to see that the hand of the government and what the hand of social engineering and what the government hopes to achieve by manipulating this disease.
I think that if we look at it from a strictly health standpoint, we ought to hope that the world can develop, that the US can develop an easy means of testing, which I think is pretty close and pretty much almost on the market now, that by which we can determine whether someone has it with a quick test. And once that's determined, and if someone has it, then only the people who have it can be sequestered and everybody else can get on with their business. And I think that's kind of what's being done, I understand, in Sweden right now, which is good. That the country's continuing on it with business as usual, and people who are vulnerable or tested, like the elderly or people with pre-existing conditions, they're the ones who are being sequestered and taken care of. And I'm suspicious of the fact that none of this has been done yet, and that we are so behind in terms of having a proper test for the virus and all these other things that we should have, like, masks and whatnot. And, my hope is that once we can catch up with that, then it can be handled like any other disease. Once you find someone who has it, then they're kept in isolation until they get better.
Yeah, I think that whatever it is, whether it's a bioweapon or not, it is what it is, virus. And that is going to be the vector. It's an airborne virus. And it will follow the trajectory of every other airborne virus, even if it's more powerful and it reaches a little bit farther, let's say 6 feet instead of 3 feet. It's
Right.
still going to follow the same vector. It's not a mosquito, which is the vector for malaria. It's not a snail, which is the vector for bilharzia in East Africa. And it's going to follow the same trajectory. And I think what we're seeing is that it is following the same trajectory as the flu every year. Now, there are certain places where it seems to be worse than others. And New York City is one of them.
Right.
And I have a correspondent in New York City, and he called me yesterday. And I said, what's going on there? And he had a very short answer to that question. It's 9/11. This is a consequence of 9/11. Now, I don't know whether you remember, you're probably too young to remember this, but when those buildings came down, a huge cloud of toxic material went up into the sky.
Yes.
And what goes up must come down. And all of this dust came down on the people of New York City. Completely toxic mess. First of all, there was asbestos on all of the girders in the World Trade Center. And then you got all the toxic metals that were involved in this thing. It was a disaster. And you could see pictures around that time of people walking down the street. Their faces are covered with dust.
Yes.
Well, that meant that their lungs were full of dust as well. And a lot of people died as a result of that. And the people who didn't die still had impaired respiratory systems. So we're now 20 years later, these people are old now, and they've got this impaired respiratory system, and these are the people that are going to die, most likely to die from the disease. So you've got a problem here, okay? You've got the United States of America, which has a place like New York City, which is probably unique in all of the world, and certainly unique in terms of this environmental catastrophe. And you've got people trying to make rules for everyone according to New York City. Well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, the situation here in let's South Bend, Indiana. How is it similar? Well, it's similar because everywhere it's going to be older people with impaired respiratory systems who are going to be the most vulnerable here. So, South Bend, Indiana, we had one death from coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
This one death is a man who is 82 years old. He shows up at the local hospital with pneumonia. They then test him. He tests positive for coronavirus. Now, if we didn't have this hysteria, he never would have been tested for that.
Right.
Okay. But because we have the hysteria in the media, everybody's going to be tested. Now he tests positive, and the next thing he dies. So now this is a corona death. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it wouldn't have been a corona death if you hadn't tested him for it. It would have just been a routine old guy shows up with pneumonia and dies. So
Right.
you can see how the statistics are going to be skewed by the hysteria and how the hysteria is being manipulated to serve certain political ends.
The virus is called a novel virus, and I think that in many ways it is, in that it is more contagious than the regular flu, and it has other characteristics that are different, which raises suspicion about whether or not this might have a biological weapon component to it. And I think there's now increasing evidence that it may. We've got Bill Gertz, who's an expert on China, who has written about a Wuhan biological weapons factory that is right near what's called the epicenter of the virus. And there's this guy from Harvard, this Lieber, who brought vials, and there's other two Chinese endocrinologists from Chicago who also were caught with vials of MERS and SARS as they tried to get out of the country. And there's all these things that are developing. I think that the last I understand, the FBI is now investigating this. And that brings up a question, of course, regardless of whether or not it does turn out to be the case, that this whole situation, the way it stands right now, is a little too convenient and a little too neat in terms of an agenda by the oligarchs, by the ruling class, what we used to call the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, people who are the globalists, people who want to get rid of, national borders and nationality and individual freedom and all of the other things that human civilization has been trying to assert since the beginning of time. They want to create this, the same goal the communists had, the same goal that the Nazis had. I mean, this is modern scientific socialism, a complete control over people. And the whole thing in the de facto sense is exactly that. I don't think this, in fact, I can say clearly that this sort of thing has never happened in this country before, where people are literally, inside, and that there are informal and even some formal laws would force them to be inside, and you could face consequences if you go outside. I mean, that is complete and total control by the state. And, it just looks to me to be a little too convenient in terms of fulfilling their agenda, although I think it's backfiring. But nevertheless, what say you with regard to the juxtaposition of the virus and the reaction and what we might call the oligarchs, the international order?
Well, there's evidence of planning here. First of all, I think that the bioweapons case is plausible. Now, it could be that it escaped accidentally. If you're smuggling this material in your socks on a commercial airline, you're not taking precautions. It could have gotten out accidentally, but it was headed back to Wuhan, and Wuhan was a place where the United States government was paying this Chinese scientist, Xi Zheng, to genetically engineer viruses as weapons. So we know that was happening.
Incredible.
You're not making weapons unless you're planning to use them at some point. And maybe this was a time they thought that they could get away with it. China, I think the United States has motive to attack China. I think we've already been in a struggle with China over trade issues. And the Chinese government certainly feels that there was an attack. And this would, in many ways, it would be the ideal situation, because you've already established that they've got the stuff over there. it would be easy to see how it could escape from a lab. And then you could do it deliberately, and they would say, oh, it escaped accidentally, and there would be plausible deniability all the way around. So I can see how that would happen. It's also not coincidence that you got a serious situation in Iran. The United States is in a state of war with Iran. There's no question about it. Right. And would someone like Mike Pompeo have scruples about doing something like this? I don't see it. I don't see the man has scruples about anything. He's capable of anything when it comes to a place like Iran. So I think it's plausible, and especially when you consider that there is no other explanation. What's the other explanation? That it mutated from a market? That it simply happened? That's not much of an explanation. This is a stronger explanation. And of course, ABC immediately, the mainstream press immediately wrote an article saying the title was something like "Sorry, Conspiracy Theorist, It's Not a Weapon" or something like that, which the title is so tendentious you begin to wonder, well, maybe they're protesting too much here. You know, maybe what the real story here is that the mainstream media have lost control of this story, that the internet is driving this story, and the mainstream media are trying to catch up with the internet in that regard. But I think it's plausible. But as I said before, even if it is a bioweapon, and even if it is designed to do you harm, it still has to travel like a virus, which means it's going to follow the same trajectory that this disease has followed in the past. And I think that it's doing that. It's doing that, and the results, as I said, the results in India are an extreme example, but they don't warrant a total shutdown of everything in the country. And so when you do have this total shutdown, and then you do have prior evidence, like the Rockefeller Foundation, I quote that study, scenario planning of the Rockefeller Foundation. It's almost exactly about like what happened. Bill Gates did the same thing in November, another scenario event. And then you combine that with the fact that the oligarchs were checking out throughout 2019. More CEOs resigned in 2019 than any period in history. Why did that happen? Was that just coincidence, or did they sense something was coming and they better cash out and get cash out at the top of the market? And if that isn't convincing enough to you, then you have the Representative Burr from North Carolina, who's on the subcommittee about health, and he cashes out within days, before the crash in the market, because he's got information about some type of health issue coming down the pike. So I think if you put all these things together, you can see an element of orchestration involved here. And that there seems to have been some planning, and that they are using this to distract us from other important things that they don't want us to see.
As far as the cashing out part, I think the same thing happened just before the mortgage meltdown of 2008. That you had big CEOs like the head of Wachovia and others cash out just before the fall. And you could even go back to the Great Depression, where some of the oligarchs converted their stock standing into real property and objects of art and other things to preserve their wealth while everything else collapsed. And then they walked in and bought it up at a bargain. So, yeah, I mean, there were people who might have inside information, or they at least sense that something is coming down the pike. We're talking about theoreticals here in terms of the United States being involved. I mean, I really have a lot of problems with that. I think that it's probably more likely that China was involved in it. The communist Chinese don't care about their own population. They would be more likely the bad player here in terms of releasing this biological weapon and then letting it spread to other countries, particularly the United States now. But of course, you and I can't know for sure because we don't have inside information. What we do know, however, is that the reaction to this event has played right into the hands of the oligarchs, and also there's a plus side to it, which we can get into next. But right now I want to talk about the actual reaction, which is that this is the dream of the communists, of the, of the, of every totalitarian system going all the way back in time. The ultimate complete control of people, their movement. We are being moved around like cords of wood. We can't leave the home. We have lost, in the de facto sense, all of our rights guaranteed by or recognized by the Constitution. You have, you can now, in some quarters, I've heard already that people are being at least fined. And if you're fined, that means you could be arrested because you've committed a crime for leaving their home, for going to a supermarket, for sneezing in public. I mean, this is something that, look, I'm not going to deny the fact that we have a contagious disease here. I can speak to it. It's real. But it all, the politics of this is very concerning. I mean, we have, we've basically rolled over and given up freedoms in the name of safety, which is exactly what Benjamin Franklin warned us not to do.
Are you talking about the United States when you're saying people are being fined for leaving their house?
Yes, I am. There's a couple of.
I knew about reports of that from Europe, but I didn't know that there was happening in the United States as well.
I think there's already been. I saw the Drudge Report this morning. There's been reports from a couple of places around the country where people are being fined and where people are being charged. There's one guy being charged as a terrorist because he sneezed in a supermarket, and the claim is that he did it deliberately. And I mean, it's just we seem to be moving down that path, and it's just I'm not saying that this is happening in the literal sense, in the de facto sense, in the United States, but it does seem we're being conditioned for it. We're being conditioned to accept it, I think, and to look upon anybody who violates these ideas because they're running around as being, enemies of the people, enemies of the state, I just, it's very concerning, and we can all feel the practical results of it right now.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of AIDS and 9/11. I mean,
Okay.
I've been thinking a lot about Hegel lately. There's a whole chapter on Hegel in Logos Rising, and a kind of dialectic progression here. So you have AIDS, which is basically a disease that was a lifestyle disease among homosexuals, which then got instrumentalized when Margaret Heckler announced in 1984 that it was caused by a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you say it's caused by a virus, well, then you immediately absolve any of the people who get it from any responsibility for contracting it.
Right.
Which is the exact opposite of what it meant before that time, because everybody knew it was a homosexual disease. It was based on homosexual lifestyle practices, and all right, I'm not one of those people. I'm not going to get it. So tough luck. I feel bad for you guys, but it's your own damn fault for acting that way. Well, all that changed is when you turned it into a virus. And then on top of that, as soon as you have a virus, well, then you start talking about a cure. And she announced in the same press conference that there was going to be a cure soon. And then so when the homosexuals, they hear this and then they start, well, what does soon mean? Like, I need it right now. I'm dying or something like that. And the pressure starts mounting and they cave into the pressure. The government does, and they approve AZT, which is chemotherapy. It was never allowed as medicine. It was so toxic they wouldn't go near it as medicine. Suddenly, because of pressure, people like Matilda Krim, for example, putting pressure on the government, they approved it, and it killed probably more homosexuals than the disease was killing.
Right.
And the difference between Magic Johnson and Arthur Ashe is that Magic Johnson started taking it, felt sick, and said, "I'm not taking this anymore," and he's alive today. And Arthur Ashe kept taking it, and he's dead. So that's the first step. Okay, you got to. They declare it's a virus. In other words, whatever it is, there's a category of nature. They apprehend it with their category of the mind, and they say it's a virus. When lots of people said, no, it's not a virus at all. And then they act on that, and then you've got the result. And then you have 9/11, which is another chapter in disaster capitalism, where you use an event. It's an undeniable event. Look at your TV screen. I mean, there's the tower.
Yes, of
It
course.
came down. Look at it. It's obvious that it happened. So therefore, you have to do what we say. Well, wait a minute. First of all, you didn't even explain how the tower came down, did you? And then you never explained Building 7, did you? Nothing touched Building 7, and that came down just like the same way the other one did, as free fall, which is indication that it was demolished by explosives. But that's never been answered. And if you say that and you're a professor, you will get fired from your job.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that now we have a new culprit, and now it's a terrorist. Okay, so the Hegelian dialectic says that's step one. Now you have step two. You combine the two of them, and now you have step three, where, as you mentioned, if you sneeze in a supermarket, you're a bioterrorist, and you can be apprehended now for the state of your medical condition or whatever. But it's all done in the name of science, and all we're trying to do is help you. Well, I mean, what we've realized, I think, is that this is a confected narrative. It's a category of the mind that is imposed on reality to allow for certain political measures. That's what we're seeing. I think it's inescapable. Even with all of the unanswered questions, it's inescapable that that's what's happening. And the best, a classic example in this regard is France. France had yellow vest protesters since 1918,
Sure.
and Macron couldn't do anything. No matter what he did, the demonstrations would not stop. Well, this solved that problem. And now you have medical martial law, and now you do have a situation where you have to basically download a permission slip from the internet to be able to go outside and go to the grocery store or walk your dog. That's the situation. And then, okay, so that solved Macron's political problem for him. Okay, but then you have to look into, well, what is exactly the type of world that is being created here? I mean, you mentioned horror movies. There's a sense in which this is like a scenario from a horror movie, but we live in a world now where you can't go to church, but you can get an abortion. Who
Of course.
decides? Who
Hashtag
decides
that.
that church? Who decides that abortion is an essential service and that church is not an essential service? Who makes that decision? I'm starting to see a pattern emerging here. In other words, you're creating a world for us according to what you think is important, you meaning the oligarchs. And I'm starting to understand that world now because of what you just did. The other thing, of course, is pornography. You can't go to church, but Pornhub is now going to offer free premium subscriptions to its pornography channel to the people of Italy, just to show what great humanitarians they are.
Just what they need.
So again, the picture of the world. You're using this. You, the oligarchs, are using this event. And I'm going to admit that it's real. It's not as bad as you're saying, but it's real. You're using it as an excuse to introduce the world that you want us to live in. And that world means, free to watch pornography, but can't go to church. Okay. There are other aspects of it as well. There's the financial aspect of it. This has been used to cover over the crash of the stock market. And the fact that Mr. Mnuchin is going to give $4 trillion to his friends. Now, to distract us from that, he's going to give each of us a check for $1,000. Again, this is...
I think that, first of all, I think that the Drudge Report today pointed out that there is a minister who is being fined because he held a session in, I think, Florida, like a mega church type session. And I know that New York City has said that they're going to shut down synagogues of Orthodox Jews because they're not, they still have their minions. They're not stopping that. So, religion's under assault. As far as the the AIDS virus. I mean, I was critical at the time of the fact that I think the gay community and their leadership ignored the problem because they were more interested in the sexual revolution than they were in the life and the safety of their own people. So they were like, go to the bathhouses, just live your life, do whatever you want to do. And in fact, I was criticized for that when I ran for Congress against Barney Frank in 2004, that I was, oh, you're a homophobe for bringing that up. And I said, look, Frank could have saved lives as a gay leader if he had simply stood up and said, look, let's not do these practices right now until we get beyond this disease. But that didn't happen because they were more interested in the sexual revolution. As far as 9/11,
the government stepped in and promoted the homosexual as the ideal citizen. They stepped in and saved homosexuality because they knew they were going to use it, as we've seen, recently with
right. And in this case, they did so at the expense of tens of thousands of gay people who died horrible deaths, and they didn't care about that. All they cared about was advancing their sexual agenda. Now,
right.
As far as 9/11, yes, there's something about that seems fishy to me. I don't know anything insider on it, but I do think that there was a problem with international Islamic terrorism and jihad. That wasn't just in this country. That was happening all over the world. That seems to have abated somewhat, but I do think that was a real threat. That doesn't mean that we had to suspend civil liberties and we all have to take our shoes off at the airport every time we go on a plane. But it was a reasonable thing, I think, for this government to take precautions against that for the same reason we took precautions against communism in the 1940s and 50s when that was on the
all of those things were instrumentalized. I don't think those dudes with box cutters did it. I think that communism was also instrumentalized. It was the biggest, and if you want to get into this, one of the biggest victims, in my opinion, was the Catholic Church through the CIA's instrumentalization of the anti-communist crusade. There was never the threat to the United States that the government claimed during that period.
Okay, well, look, Mike, we're going to have to agree to disagree on certain things with regard to that. What I will say is that the Catholic Church deserves a lot of credit for being one of the bulwarks against communism. You had Cardinal Mindszenty in Hungary being put into prison. You had a cardinal in, I think, Yugoslavia as well, I think in Croatia. And that these men stood up against, they stood up against communism. And of course, John Paul II, I think, played a very key role in collapsing the Soviet Union when he held mass in Poland, the largest gathering in history. I think there was almost 1 million people came out, and he spoke about God and he spoke about Christ and he preached. And that was the beginning of the end. They couldn't fight that. Same thing with Reagan when he was in Moscow. He spoke about God, he went to church.
But again, Chuck, I think we have to distinguish between categories of reality and categories of the mind here. Okay, I'm not going to deny that there was such a thing called communism. I'm not going to deny that it was a terrible thing. Okay, but at the same time, the meaning of that for Americans got imposed on us by people who had a certain political agenda in mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about people like C.D. Jackson, who was simultaneously employed by the CIA and Time magazine, who said in 1953 that the United States had lost its best salesman. Who was he referring to? He was referring to Stalin and the death of Stalin. And this was instrumentalized for certain ends. And I think that the Catholic Church was taken for a ride during the 1950s and basically encouraged to side with a group of people that did not have their interest in mind and was working against them simultaneously.
Well, you're obviously the expert on Catholic issues. I mean, from my outsider perspective, I think that the 1950s was the pinnacle of Catholic morality in the world. I mean, it was really stood up for the right side and continued to do so. I read a book a while ago about this by a Catholic thinker, something about Goodbye, Good Men, I believe it was called. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And it dealt with this pinnacle, and then how things started to degrade when you had the social engineers go into the seminary and start to talk about legitimizing homosexuality and whatnot. And that
Yes.
he documents how that they kind of wormed their way into the subverted the church. But that's a different subject. I want to get back to the virus and what we're dealing with right now. The aspect of this that I think has backfired on the establishment, even whether or not they caused it, whether or not it's biologic, the thing is that they're riding it and they're using it. It's like what Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they're not letting it go to waste so quickly. I think a good example is that every time President Trump, who I think is on our side, speaks up and mentions, hey, we have this possible cure here, the chloroquine or whatever, they attack that. Anything, in other words, they want to prolong it long enough to really do damage on both our economy and on our psyche. But the positive aspect is that people are realizing, and we kind of talked about this before going on the air, that it is a great tradition in America, it's a great tradition in humanity to be prepared for crisis individually, to have enough supplies to last you, 4 to 6 weeks, to do things at home with your family, to homeschool. I think this is an opportunity, and they're already complaining that people are realizing they don't need these massive government-run high schools and schools, that they can teach their children their way at home, and that these children are going to end up better off. They're going to learn how to think cognitively as opposed to sitting there in a propaganda room and being preached to and treated like monkeys. So there are positive things that can come out of this if we understand them and if we talk about them openly and start to use them. And then at the end of the day, once this thing is over, the other thing is that offices and businesses are now realizing that they don't need these massive office buildings in the downtown cities because people can work from home. They can telecommute. My wife is telecommuting. Everybody can sit at home with their computer and telecommute and then have time with their children, have time with their family, have time with their spouse, have time to go out and walk around. We're not going to be like tethered to these big offices. So I think there are going to be some positive shifts, perhaps, in our society, societal shifts. These are the sorts of things that are studied by sociologists that are good and that are possibly quite positive. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I said that there's never been a time when God hasn't been in charge of human history. And Hegel talked about the cunning of reason, how the intentions of wicked men get thwarted by God and turned into good. And I can see that here to some extent. Roberto de Mattei talked about the end of globalism. A lot of people are talking about the end of globalism.
Yes.
And suddenly it turns out that borders are important. I mean,
Exactly.
we're all talking about the border between Indiana and Michigan. Whoever talked about the border between Indiana and Michigan before? But if you look at, let's say, the difference between Italy and Germany right now, it seems that there's a significant difference in how the virus is acting in those two countries because they have two very different cultures. Just to give one instance, northern Italy is a very polluted place, and the lungs of the people there are compromised. There's no question about it. Germany is a country that has always taken environmental issues seriously. And so they may not have the same lung problem in Germany that they had in Italy. So I mean, what we're saying here is that there is a real difference between these two countries. And the borders are important because they define real differences. These are categories of reality. German and Italian is not something that you're imposing on. It's not your category of the mind that you're imposing on these people. It exists in reality. They're two different languages, they're two different cultures, and they're two different reactions to the disease. That being said, this doesn't change the intentions of the wicked. And we have to be aware of what their intentions are, and we have to think of how we're going to resist them, at least intellectually.
Right, sure.
So, for example, right now we have uh, people coming out of the woodwork, like Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is now, the big battle is now, how long are these conditions going to last? Jeffrey Sachs wants them to last until July. He's talking
Hmm.
about July.
Right, sure.
Well, I think in order to evaluate this man's suggestions, we have to understand who he is. Who he is. He's a notorious looter. He is a has wrecked economies throughout the world. He wrecked the economy in Bolivia and brought the communists to power as a result. He wrecked the economy through privatization in Poland after the fall of communism. And his most notorious example was wrecking the economy of Russia by handing it over. I hope that's not coronavirus.
Oh
By
boy.
handing it over to 8 oligarchs, 7 of whom were Jews.
Hmm.
Jeffrey Sachs is a Jew. He was working for Harvard University, which is a Jewish institution, in case you didn't know that. The head of Harvard University was Larry Summers at this point, also a Jew who has failed upward for his entire life. What we have is a group of people. I think that the strategy of Jeffrey Sachs is clear. First of all, Jeffrey Sachs should be ashamed of himself and should spend his life in a monastery doing penance for all of the misery he's caused in this world. He's not someone we need to look up to as an expert. Okay. But secondly, there's an agenda here, and I think it's up to us to understand it. And the agenda seems to me pretty clear. Okay. Convince Donald Trump to continue this draconian lockdown until he wrecks the economy. And then by wrecking the economy, he will ensure that he will not get elected in the fall. Now, this is not in Donald Trump's interest. It's not, I don't think it's in the country's interest, but it is in the oligarchs' interest. And Jeffrey Sachs is a representative of the oligarchs. And I think we have to be aware of what's going on. You know, as we said, God can bring good out of evil. That's for sure. But we have to understand what the evil is and what we're dealing with, too, at the same time.
I think that, I mean, I'm not all that familiar with Jeffrey Sachs, and I'll certainly look into that. I think that whether or not he or others, whether they worship on Saturday or Sunday is not all that relevant. You have these oligarchs across the board in terms of putting out various shingles that proclaim religious backgrounds, including Catholics, and we could name several. But the relevant thing with them is that they form an elite that has struggled for power going all the way back to the time of Nimrod. I mean, we could look at this biblically if you want. And that is people who believe that God should be overthrown in heaven and that they have some kind of divine right to control the world and do so. Many of them actually believe that they're doing so for altruistic reasons. They've convinced themselves. But it doesn't matter to me whether they think that or not. The fact is, they don't have a right to control me or anyone else. And they are attempting, I mean, we could go back to Alexander the Great. I mean, this is a movement that's occurred in every generation since Adam and Eve conspired by eating the apple from the forbidden fruit. You know, that they would they would have all knowledge. They would know good and evil. In other words, they would take over from God. Man would overthrow God in heaven, basically, and control his own destiny and his own life and the world. And it is a conspiracy, and it has existed in every generation. This generation is no different. And every generation has had people who are conscious of the fact that God is sovereign and that we are created in the image of God. We're not God, but as such, we grant government, we grant earthly powers limited power so that they can preserve our right to be free and to be, in a sense, sovereign as images of God, and that this is a conspiracy against that. And whether or not this virus is accidental or real, this is going to be exploited by those who want to undermine our individual freedom and our right. The Constitution clearly states, and it's a reflection, I think, of reality when it says that we're created. We're all endowed by our Creator. that comes right out of the book of Genesis. I mean, that's biblical. That's, God said that God created man and woman, and it does say man and woman in his image. And that these people want to subvert that. They want to say we're the ones who are in charge. We're the international rulers. I don't care whether they, have a mezuzah or a cross on the door. The point is that they're anti-religion, they're anti-God, and that's the key.
Right. I agree. And one of the great things about the internet is that we have this ability to have these conversations. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me to talk about this. But we have to name who we're talking about. Okay. And it's, you're right. It's not just Jews, it's Catholics too. Okay. And the center of this Catholic conspiracy is the Jesuits in this country. And the Jesuit magazine, America, just did an article, I quote it in the article I've written, where the guy begins by saying, I am a scientist, cancel mass. Well, what you're doing here is you're using this fake science to shut down any discussion. Okay. And then you're using the shutting down the discussion to basically impose your views on everyone else. And we can't object. I mean, I can't object to this guy because he's a scientist. What am I supposed to say?
He's wrapped himself in the flag of science, just like what Darwin did.
But it's
if you
more
question
than that.
it, you're anti-science.
It's more than that. He's telling that he's using this to impose this regimen on Catholics, on fellow Catholics.
Right.
So you got Catholics involved, you got Jews involved, but we have to be able to name who these people are, because if we don't, then we're just saying, oh, we're not helping, we're not moving the ball down the field. Because now we know who's doing it, and now we know there's the agenda. The Jesuits are a fifth column in the Catholic Church. They are the main promoters of homosexuality in the Catholic Church today. James Martin is the main promoter of homosexuality in the Catholic Church. He's a Jesuit. He's on the editorial staff of America magazine that published that. I mean, if I can't talk about these people by name, then we're crippled. We have to be able to mention people by name. Because if we don't, when we shut up, all the people are going to think is, oh yeah, oligarchs. But if we do mention the names and the people start reading, the name pops up again, they'll be immunized, to use a relevant term. They'll be immunized because they understand the agenda that these people are promoting.
No, look, I agree with that. And I've been critical of the ADL and some of the establishment Jewish organizations, which I think really are socialist. As far as the Jesuits, I'm not in a position to know. I think that they do a pretty good job running Boston College, which is over near where I live. I don't know. I mean, maybe you might be too sweeping, but that's a Catholic question.
No, it's not a Catholic question. Okay, you're right. It is. We're talking about Catholics. It's a question about the way this agenda gets imposed on Americans. These are the commissars that impose the oligarchic rule on Catholics. The ADL are the commissars that impose it on Jews through fear. They spread fear throughout the Jewish population. It's anti-Semitism. We have to do something. We're going crazy. And in both instances, you have a group of commissars taking control of their constituency for the benefit of the oligarchs.
No, I'm with you on this one. We're on the same side. I want to just ask you a little practical question here, which is with regard to church attending Mass. In my Jewish community, we're doing this thing with the Zoom, and we can't have a full minyan because you have to be there in person. But at least we are having daily prayers. My wife gets a lot out of this. We still can say Kaddish for the dead. There are certain things that are being done to try to continue. And if anything, there are more people who are interested in it than might have otherwise been going to the synagogue. So is the Catholic Church doing anything equivalent to that in terms of making sure that people get some, you can't obviously have the full sacrament unless you're there, but are there any services being done with Zoom or anything online?
Yeah, there are televised masses. unfortunately, you cannot have a Catholic Mass on television. It's
Right.
impossible.
No, the same thing with
The
a service.
The Jewish equivalent would be something like the temple, animal sacrifice on television. Well, you can't do
No,
that.
and you can't
Okay.
have certain aspects of the Jewish service on television either. I mean, you
Well,
have to be there.
the crucial aspect of the Mass is Holy Communion. Obviously, you can
Right.
have the first part of the Mass, which is the reading of the Word of God. Obviously, you can do that. And most Protestant services are simply that. It's the reading of the Word of God, and then there's a sermon, and there's some singing. But that's only half of the Catholic Mass. The second half is when the priest consecrates the bread and wine and turns it into the body and blood of Christ, and then you receive that. Well, you
Mhm.
can't download Holy Communion from your computer. And so as a result, what you have here is a picture of the Mass and not the Mass itself. And so the equivalent would be, like, gee, I really feel hungry. I think I'll turn on a food show and watch it
No,
on
I get it.
television so that I don't feel hungry anymore. That's not going to work. And the same thing,
No.
that's the problematic aspect with Mass. And I think that the bishops, first of all, the bishop, the first time around, said, okay, we've got a problem here. No reception. Nobody, we don't have everybody drinking out of the same cup. That's not a good idea. Uh, take the communion host on your hand and separate in the pew. And that seemed to be a reasonable accommodation. Then
Sure.
they banned the whole thing. Banning the whole thing is not reasonable. That is
No, I
not
agree.
reasonable. And I think it has created more problems than it's going to solve. You now have a church state problem because the question, as you brought up, this man in Florida. Now
Mhm.
that as far as I know, it's a Protestant service. It could be done over television. Okay, there's no difference. Okay,
Right.
but now you've got a church state problem of saying, well, who's in charge now? And we're approaching Easter. Who gets to decide whether we celebrate Easter or not? Okay, the church or the state? Or the next question is, okay, all right, maybe we don't celebrate Easter. Trump has said it's going to end on April 30th. Who decides when it's going to end? Who decides when when the priest is allowed to celebrate the Mass? There is no precedent for this in American history. We have it wasn't originally the separation of church and state, but it became de facto the separation of church and state, which means in this instance, the state has no right to regulate the services of the churches. How are we going to
Yeah.
resolve this issue?
No, look at. I mean, I tend to agree with you on this. I mean, I think there's been a heroic story, at least one case where a priest is delivering confession in the parking lot, wearing a blindfold, sitting on a chair, and conducting the service, which I think is amazing and great. Probably more people are getting confession than otherwise might, because of there's a sense like, hey, the church is under siege. We have to come out and do something. As far as synagogue goes, the reason that the Orthodox synagogues are being threatened in New York, and they're saying we're going to shut the whole thing down, is because you have to have 10 adult males who have been bar mitzvahed in order to have a minyan. And that the minyan, there are certain prayers and certain functions that can only be done with a minyan. Without a minyan, you can't do it. So this is a problem. I mean, there is the televised thing, the Zoom thing, but they can't really do the whole service because it's not a minyan. You can't have a minyan on a computer. You have to be there in witness. You have to have
Right.
10. So, yeah, I mean, this is a big church state issue, as you say. Anyway, Mike, we're reaching toward the end of the program, so I'd like you to talk a little bit about your soon to be released book, Logos Rising. I think you mentioned that it's supposed to be available first of the month, which is only a week or two away.
No, it's tomorrow.
There we
It's
go.
tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
The copies are being shipped today. We get them probably tomorrow, and we start fulfilling orders on Thursday. So it's that immediate. We have had a large initial response, and we're close to selling out the first printing.
Mm.
So if you can, these are the people that are going to we're going to send the copies to first. The people who are on the list. So if you want to be sure about getting a copy, you can go to culturewars.com.
Okay.
And sign up for a copy. Now, what did I say before? I said that there's never been a time in history when God wasn't in charge of human history. The Hebrew scriptures are evidence of that, an intimate connection between God and the course of human history. Greeks didn't understand it, the Hebrews did, and then Christianity merged the two of them. And so you had a metaphysical understanding of history. But the point here is that most people don't see that. And why don't you see that? Because you don't have the eyes to see that, because you don't have the perspective. And that's why I wrote Logos Rising. Okay, the first part of the book is called The History of Logos. In other words, where does this word come from? How did it develop? But the second part is called the Logos of history. And that explains, once you understand this power of God, you understand that he's intimately involved in the development of history. And this, I think, will give you the eyes to see how it's developing, how so that you can have the perspective to deal with issues like this and not just go crazy and jump off a bridge because the world is coming to an end. That's the type of panic that the culture is spreading. This is the type of book that's going to give you the perspective so you can deal with that, with the big picture in mind. That's why I think it's, to be honest with you, I think it's the book for this moment. It's the right time.
Timely. Yep.
You need some type of perspective, and this is it. Hegel said the owl of Minerva only flies at twilight. What's he mean? The owl of Minerva, wisdom, only comes twilight. Well, we're seeing the twilight of the gods here, the twilight of the empire, and that releases us, from the hold that it had on our minds, and we can see it in a much better perspective, and that's what this book is about.
Well, no, it's excellent timing for this book. I'm looking forward to reading it, and definitely, hopefully, having you back to talk about it as things unfold, and checking in with you, E. Michael Jones. Mentioned, of course, culturewars.com for the magazine, and you've got a YouTube channel, and you're up there with doing a lot of great interviews. So, Mike, thanks again. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure, Chuck. Good to talk to you.
Same here. Thanks a lot.
Okay.